The impeachment trial of President Donald Trump. Now reporting, George Stephanopoulos.
Good afternoon and welcome to our special coverage of the Senate trial of President Trump. The final votes today. The president impeached by the House on December 19th on a near party line vote. This trial began 3 weeks ago in the Senate. And today, no more mysteries. Every single Democrat will vote to convict the president. Every single Republican, save one, will vote to acquit the president. That Republican, Mitt Romney, he spoke on the Senate floor earlier this afternoon.
As a senator juror, I swore an oath before God to exercise impartial justice. I am profoundly religious. My faith is at the heart of who I am. The grave question the Constitution tasks senators to answer is whether the president committed an act so extreme and egregious that it rises to the level of a high crime and misdemeanor. Yes, he did.
I want to go to our senior congressional correspondent, Mary Bruce, up there on Capitol Hill. Mary, a piece of history right there. No senator has ever voted to convict a president of his own party in an impeachment trial.
And, George, this was so dramatic and surprising, even though we knew this was a possibility, because Mitt Romney on the floor this morning doing what no one else in his party has been willing to do, to go out there and say that not only is what the president did here wrong, but he said it was, quote, an appalling abuse of public trust. He went on to say that it was a flagrant assault on our electoral rights, our national security, and our fundamental values. This was a deeply difficult and personal decision for Mitt Romney. He said at the beginning of his remarks that his faith, his Mormon faith, weighed heavily on this decision, saying that it was a decision made out of an inescapable conviction that my oath before God demanded it. And we know that he was thinking about not just what would happen here today, but what future generations would be thinking when they look back on how Mitt Romney and how Republicans handled this decision, how the lens of history is going to treat all of this. And, George, it is just remarkable when you consider the fact that Mitt Romney used to be the Republican standard bearer. He was the Republican nominee for president not long ago, and now the only senator here to break with his party and vote to convict the president.
Long and complicated history with President Trump as well. Accepted his endorsement in 2012, was harshly critical of him during the 2016 campaign, but has voted with him more than 80% of the time in the Senate. I want to go to our chief White House correspondent, John Carl, for more on this. John, coming in today, the president had hoped for a bipartisan vote for acquittal, but one by one, those Democrats who were on the fence, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Kirsten Sinema of Arizona, Doug Jones of Alabama, all said they would vote to convict on both counts. And now he faces this vote from Mitt Romney. Imagine he is livid.
There's no question about that, George. Look, in practical terms, it doesn't mean anything. The president, either with or without Mitt Romney's votes, was not going to be removed from office. But symbolically, it is everything. The White House has pushed very hard to portray this as a purely partisan impeachment. And in the House, that's exactly what it was. Not a single Republican voted to impeach the president. And they really believed that's what was going to be the situation in the Senate. But now here you have a Republican, and not just any Republican, but the former Republican presidential nominee come out and say that he is voting to remove the president from office, to convict him on impeachment.
Chris Christie, you know Mitt Romney, you know Donald Trump. What's your read?
It's a very complicated relationship between these two guys. You go back to 2012, where Trump enthusiastically endorsed him, and Romney was right up here in New York at Trump Tower enthusiastically embracing Donald Trump. Fast forward to 2016, Romney took no position in the presidential race until Trump pulled ahead. And then he made that really stinging indictment of Trump in the speech he gave in 2016. Yet he sat twice in Trump Tower and interviewed to be Donald Trump's Secretary of State. So this is a really complicated issue, and I don't think it's nearly as clear as it's being portrayed today. There's a lot of personal going on here, George.
Chief Justice is in the chamber right now. Let's listen in.
House of Representatives against Donald John Trump, President of the United States. As a reminder to everyone in the chamber, as well as those in the galleries, demonstrations of approval or disapproval are prohibited.
The majority leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, the Senate is now ready to vote on the articles of impeachment, and after that is done, we will adjourn the court of impeachment.
The clerk will now read the first article of impeachment.
Article 1, Abuse of Power. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives, quote, shall have the sole power of impeachment, unquote, and that the President, quote, shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, close quote. In his conduct of the office of President of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States, and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in that, using the powers of his office, President Trump solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 United States presidential election. He did so through a scheme or course of conduct that included soliciting the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations that would benefit his re-election, harm the election prospects of a political opponent, and influence the 2020 United States presidential election to his advantage. President Trump also sought to pressure the government of Ukraine to take these steps by conditioning official United States government acts of significant value to Ukraine on its public announcement of the investigations. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct for corrupt purposes in pursuit of personal political benefit. In doing so, President Trump used the powers of the presidency in a manner that compromised the national security of the United States and undermined the integrity of the United States democratic process. He thus ignored and injured the interests of the nation. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct through the following means. 1. President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, corruptly solicited the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations into a political opponent, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., and B, a discredited theory promoted by Russia alleging that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 United States presidential election. 2, with the same corrupt motives, President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within the outside of the United States government, conditioned 2 official acts on the public announcements that he had requested. A, the release of $391 million of United States taxpayer funds that Congress had appropriated on a bipartisan basis for the purpose of providing vital military and security assistance to Ukraine to oppose Russian aggression, and which President Trump had ordered suspended. And B, a head of state meeting at the White House, which the President of Ukraine sought to demonstrate continued United States support for the government of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. 3, faced with the public revelation of his actions, President Trump ultimately released the military and security assistance to the government of Ukraine and has persisted in openly and corruptly urging and soliciting Ukraine to undertake investigations for his personal political benefit. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous invitations of foreign interference in United States elections. In all of this, President Trump abused the powers of the presidency by ignoring and injuring national security and other vital national interests to obtain an improper personal political benefit. He has also betrayed the nation by abusing his high office to enlist a foreign power in corrupting democratic elections. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
Each senator, when his or her name is called, will stand in his or her place and vote guilty or not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules on Impeachment. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment provides that no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. The question is on the first article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Not guilty. Mr. Alexander, not guilty. Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Not guilty. Mr. Barrasso, not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Guilty. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Not guilty. Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Guilty. Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Blunt, not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, not guilty. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, not guilty. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Not guilty. Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, not guilty. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Ms. Harris. Ms. Harris, guilty. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson.
Not guilty.
Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Jones.
Guilty.
Mr. Jones, guilty. Mr. Kane.
Guilty.
Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kennedy.
Not guilty.
Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King.
Guilty.
Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee.
Not guilty.
Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler. Mrs. Loeffler, not guilty. Mr. Manchin.
Guilty.
Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally, not guilty. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, not guilty. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue, not guilty. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, not guilty. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, guilty. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, not guilty. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, not guilty. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall, guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, not guilty.
There you have it. President Trump acquitted in the Senate. Near party line vote. All the Democrats voting to convict. All the Republicans, save one, voting to acquit the president. Stark scene there on the Senate floor. No long speeches, just the senators standing at their seats and delivering their verdict on the president. There is one more article to come as the clerk tallies the roll right there. And Mary Bruce up there on Capitol Hill, you really could tell it's a different Senate convened for this trial.
Absolutely, George. It is remarkable just to see all of the senators there one by one having to stand and announce guilty or not guilty after the weeks of this intense trial. And I will say it did come as a bit of a surprise today to see how unified Democrats were. We just moments before this vote, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia announcing that he was going to stand with the party and vote to convict the president, of course, shattering Donald Trump's hopes that he would have a bipartisan acquittal. But in the end, Joe Manchin, even though we know that this was a very difficult decision for him, a politically risky decision for the red state senator. The president is very popular back home in West Virginia, but he said ultimately that the president's actions, of course, did rise to the level of impeachment and removal.
48 senators have pronounced Donald John Trump, president of the United States, guilty as charged. 52 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the first article of impeachment.
Chief Justice reminding us there that on the actual conviction, this vote not close. It was not close to a two-thirds vote.
Article 2, obstruction of Congress. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. In his conduct of the office of the President of the United States and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has directed the unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives pursuant to its sole power of impeachment. President Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution, in that the House of Representatives has engaged in an impeachment inquiry focused on President Trump's corrupt solicitation of the government of Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 United States presidential election. As part of this impeachment inquiry, the committee's undertaking the investigation serves subpoenas seeking documents and testimony deemed vital to the inquiry from various executive branch agencies and offices and current and former officials. In response, without lawful cause or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas. President Trump thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to the exercise of the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. President Trump abused the powers of his high office through the following means. 1, directing the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents sought therein by the committees. 2, directing other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, in response to which the Department of State, Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense refused to produce a single document or record. 3, directing current and former executive branch officials not to cooperate with the committees, in response to which 9 administration officials defied subpoenas for testimony, namely John Michael Mick Mulvaney, Robert B. Blair, John A. Eisenberg, Michael Ellis, Kristen Wells Griffith, Russell T. Vaught, Michael Duffy, Brian McCormick, and T. Ulrich Reckbull. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous efforts to undermine United States government investigations into foreign interference in United States elections. Through these actions, President Trump sought to arrogate to himself the right to determine the propriety, scope, and nature of an impeachment inquiry into his own conduct, as well as the unilateral prerogative to deny any and all information to the House of Representatives in the exercise of its sole power of impeachment. In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. This abuse of office served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and control the power of impeachment, and thus to nullify a vital constitutional safeguard vested solely in the House of Representatives. In all of this, President Trump has acted in a manner contrary to his trust as president and subversive of the constitutional government, to the great prejudice of the cause of law and justice, and to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
The question is on the second article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Not guilty. Not guilty. Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Mr. Barrasso? Not guilty. Mr. Bennett? Guilty. Mrs. Blackburn?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal? Guilty. Mr. Blunt? Not guilty. Mr. Booker? Guilty. Mr. Bozeman? Not guilty. Mr. Braun? Not guilty. Mr. Brown? Guilty. Mr. Burr? Not guilty. Ms. Cantwell? Guilty. Mrs. Capito? Not guilty. Mr. Cardin? Guilty. Mr. Carper? Guilty. Mr. Casey? Guilty. Mr. Cassidy? Not guilty. Ms. Collins? Not guilty. Mr. Coons? Guilty. Mr. Cornyn? Not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto? Guilty. Mr. Cotton? Not guilty. Mr. Kramer? Not guilty. Mr. Crapo? Not guilty. Mr. Cruz? Not guilty. Mr. Daines? Not guilty. Ms. Duckworth? Guilty. Mr. Durbin? Guilty. Mr. Enzi? Not guilty. Ms. Ernst? Not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein? Guilty. Mrs. Fisher? Not guilty. Mr. Gardner? Not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand? Guilty. Mr. Graham? Not guilty. Mr. Grassley? Not guilty. Ms. Harris? Guilty. Ms. Hassan? Guilty. Mr. Hawley? Not guilty. Mr. Heinrich? Guilty. Ms. Hirono? Guilty. Mr. Hoven? Not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Inhofe? Not guilty. Mr. Johnson?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Jones? Guilty. Mr. Kane? Guilty. Mr. Kennedy? Not guilty. Mr. King? Guilty. Ms. Klobuchar? Guilty. Mr. Langford? Not guilty. Mr. Leahy? Guilty. Mr. Lee?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler? Not guilty. Mr. Manchin? Guilty. Mr. Markey? Guilty. Mr. McConnell? Not guilty. Ms. McSally? Not guilty. Mr. Menendez? Guilty. Mr. Merkley? Guilty. Mr. Moran? Not guilty. Ms. Murkowski? Not guilty. Mr. Murphy? Guilty. Mrs. Murray? Guilty. Mr. Paul?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Perdue? Not guilty. Mr. Peters? Guilty. Mr. Portman? Not guilty. Mr. Reed? Guilty. Mr. Risch? Not guilty. Mr. Roberts? Not guilty. Mr. Romney? Not guilty. Ms. Rosen? Guilty. Mr. Rounds? Not guilty. Mr. Rubio? Not guilty. Mr. Sanders? Guilty. Mr. Sass? Not guilty. Mr. Schatz? Guilty. Mr. Schumer? Guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida? Not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen? Guilty. Mr. Shelby? Not guilty. Ms. Sinema? Guilty. Ms. Smith? Guilty. Ms. Stabenow? Guilty. Mr. Sullivan? Not guilty. Mr. Tester? Guilty. Mr. Thune? Not guilty. Mr. Tillis? Not guilty. Mr. Toomey? Not guilty. Mr. Udall? Guilty. Mr. Van Hollen? Guilty. Mr. Warner? Guilty. Ms. Warren? Guilty. Mr. Whitehouse? Guilty. Mr. Wicker? Not guilty. Mr. Wyden? Guilty. Mr. Young? Not guilty.
There you have it. On Article 2, President Trump acquitted. Straight party line vote. 53 for acquittal, all Republicans, 47 for guilty, all Democrats. They will tally the roll now. The Chief Justice will announce the verdict, and then the trial will be adjourned. Somewhat quicker trial than the one faced by President Clinton back in 1999, which stretched on after hearing depositions from witnesses for several weeks. Chief Justice now looking at the tally.
On this article of impeachment, 47 senators have pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 53 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that respondent Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the second article of impeachment. The presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, President of the United States, upon 2 articles of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and 2/3 of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charges contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby, acquitted of the charges in said articles.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
I send an order to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Ordered that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Before this process fully concludes, I want to very quickly acknowledge a few of the people who helped the Senate fulfill our duty these past weeks. First and foremost, I know my colleagues join me in thanking Chief Justice Roberts for presiding over the Senate trial with a clear head, steady hand, and the forbearance that this rare occasion demands. We know full well that his presence as our presiding officer came in addition to, not instead of, his day job across the street. So the Senate thanks the Chief Justice and his staff who helped him perform this unique role. Like his predecessor, Chief Justice Rehnquist, the Senate will be awarding Chief Justice Roberts the Golden Gavel. To commemorate his time presiding over this body, we typically award this to new senators after about 100 hours in the chair, but I think we can agree the Chief Justice has put in his due and then some. The page is delivering the gavel.
Thank you very much.
Of course, there are countless Senate professionals whose efforts were essential. I'll have more thorough thanks to offer next week to all of those teams, from the Secretary of the Senate's office to the parliamentarians, to the Sergeant at Arms team, and beyond. But there are two more groups I'd like to single out now. First, the two different classes of Senate pages who participated in this trial. Their footwork and cool under pressure literally kept the floor running. Our current class came on board right in the middle of the third presidential impeachment trial in American history and quickly found themselves hand-delivering 180 question cards from senators' desks to the dais. No pressure, right, guys? So thank you all very much for your good work. And second, the fine men and women of the Capitol Police, we know that the safety of our democracy literally rests in their hands every single day. But the heightened measures surrounding the trial meant even more hours and even more work and even more vigilance. Thank you all very much for your service to this body and to the country.
The chair recognizes the Democratic leader.
I join the Republican leader in thanking the personnel who aided the Senate over the past several weeks. Capitol Police do an outstanding job day in, day out to protect the members of this chamber, their staffs, the press, and everyone who works in and visits this Capitol. They were asked to work extra shifts and in greater numbers to provide additional security over the past 3 weeks. Thank you to every one of them. I, too, would like to thank those wonderful pages. I so much enjoyed you with your serious faces walking down right here and giving the Chief Justice our questions. As the leader noted, the new class of pages started midway in this impeachment trial. When you take a new job, you're usually given a few days to take stock of things, get up to speed. This class was given no such leeway, but they stepped right in, didn't miss a beat, ferrying hundreds of questions from U.S. senators to the Chief Justice on national television is not how most of us spend our first week at work, but they did it with aplomb. I'd also like to extend my personal thank you to David Houck, the Director of the Office of Accessibility Services, Tyler Pumphrey, the Supervisor, and Grace Ridgway, the wonderful Director of Capitol Facilities. Everyone Grace's team worked so hard to make sure we were ready for impeachment. Gary Richardson, known affectionately to us as Tiny, the chief chamber attendant. Jim Hoover and the cabinet shop, who built new cabinets to deprive us of the use of our electronics and flip phones during the trial. Brenda Bird and her team did a spectacular job of keeping the Capitol clean, and Lyden Webb and his team who moved the furniture and then moved it again and again and again. Grace, we appreciate all your hard work. Please convey our sincerest thanks to your staff. Thank you all, the whole staff, for your diligent work through many long days and late nights during this very trying time in our nation's history.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The chair also wishes to make a very brief statement. I would like to begin by thanking the Majority Leader and the Democratic Leader for their support as I attempted to carry out ill-defined responsibilities in an unfamiliar setting. They ensured that I had the wise counsel of the Senate itself through its secretary and her legislative staff. I am especially grateful to the parliamentarian and her deputy for their unfailing patience and keen insight. I am likewise grateful to the Sergeant at Arms and his staff for the assistance and many courtesies that they extended during my period of required residency. And thank you all for making my presence here as comfortable as possible. As I depart the chamber, I do so with an invitation to visit the court. By long tradition and in memory of the 135 years we sat in this building, we keep the front row of the gallery in our courtroom open for members of Congress who might want to drop by to see an argument or to escape one. I also depart with sincere good wishes as we carry out our common commitment to the Constitution through the distinct roles assigned to us by that charter. You have been generous hosts, and I look forward to seeing you again under happier circumstances. The chair recognizes the majority leader.
I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the articles against Donald John Trump, adjourn, sine die.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to. The Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment, stands adjourned, sine die.
Chief Justice will now be escorted from the chamber as he gavels the Senate trial of President Trump to a close, thanking the senators for their work, for their hospitality, in essence, over the last several weeks, and encouraging them in their, what he called, all of their common commitment to the Constitution. We've now had 2 presidential impeachments in the last 21 years. Presidents impeached by the House, acquitted by the Senate. I want to start with Terry Moran right now. Terry, reminder of the words of Ken Starr when he was defending the president on the Senate floor, prosecuted President Clinton, defended President Trump, and rued what he called the age of impeachment.
The age of impeachment, which he, as you pointed out, was one of the instigators of. But if it becomes just another weapon in partisan warfare, then it does undermine the scheme of constitutional government. This verdict will be part of that, no question about it. I thought it would be an anticlimax since we mostly knew what was going to happen. But it wasn't. The weight of history, the weight of personal judgment was hanging over that Senate chamber. And now, what to make of the conduct of President Trump as revealed in this impeachment process is up to the voters. It doesn't look like they're very much concerned about it to the point where it will be the make or break issue in the election. But the votes of those Democrats from red states, especially Doug Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, Doug Jones of Alabama, and Mitt Romney, they do show that maybe there is a center in this partisan warfare, that the president did wrong, and that he cannot be completely exonerated. At the end of the day, I think the problem is for Democrats going forward, though, they spent years trying to drive this president from office through impeachment. What was the opportunity cost of that? Are they only known before the voters in the fall as the party of outrage and contempt? They'll need more.
That is going to be up to the voters to decide, Pierre Thomas. It will be up to the voters to determine the fate of President Trump, whether he stays in the White House. But meantime, the courts continue their work and prosecutors continue their work on some of these underlying issues.
George, absolutely right. Unclear how this unfolds in the near future, except that we will learn more. We have that book coming out by the former National Security Advisor John Bolton. And as you said, the Southern District of New York prosecutors there and the FBI continue to investigate the circumstances of the firing of the former ambassador to the Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. Rudy Giuliani plays a role in that investigation. We understand he's being looked at as well as the activity of 2 of his close colleagues, Igor Fruman and Lev Parnas, who were involved in the efforts to dig up dirt on Joe Biden and his son. So much more to come. We'll have to see how the American public views it, George.
John Carl, up until this defection by Mitt Romney, the president's hold on the Republican Party actually strengthened over the course of this impeachment proceedings in the House and the trial in the Senate. Yet he also does have to contend with, even though senators have voted to acquit him, not all said that what he did was appropriate.
Several of them said that they thought it was inappropriate, that he shouldn't have done it. Susan Collins of Maine actually went so far as to say that she believes that the president learned from this experience and he would act differently in the future. There's no evidence of that, though, George, in the record here. The president, throughout this process from day one, insisted he did absolutely nothing wrong. And even though you did hear some of those Republicans who ultimately voted to acquit be critical of him, by and large, most of the Republican Party in the Congress and apparently in the country at large agreed with that. In fact, his standing overall, his approval ratings right now are as high as they have ever been. On the Gallup poll, the highest it has ever been just this week.
Yeah, approaching 50% at 49%. Cecilia Vega, we just heard from Pierre Thomas that John Bolton still has that book coming out. We also learned today that he's quite likely to be called as a witness in the House.
House Judiciary Chair Jerry Nadler today said such, and basically is implying that these investigations will continue to go on. But it's not a done deal. I mean, there is still division among the Democrats over whether that's the right move to do. We don't know how Nancy Pelosi feels about that, and we know how long it took her to get to this point to come to impeachment. Bolton has suggested that he would be willing to testify. We've been talking about that in recent weeks. That was sort of that 11th hour bombshell heading into this Senate trial. Of course, Pierre mentioned the book, and we know these new allegations that have come out from Bolton in recent weeks with his firsthand knowledge of President Trump and his dealings with Ukraine. The other, I think, elephant in the room is Joe Biden. Rudy Giuliani has suggested that Joe Biden should be 100% should be investigated, he said, going forward. So there is a lot more to come still. I think this fight is not necessarily done in terms of investigations, in terms of allegations. I think even the White House knows that there is more to be talked about. There is potentially more to come, and they're not happy with this Bolton book coming out and the slow leak that we're going to see of information coming in the next days, weeks to come.
But we likely will hear from the president next days as well, giving his verdict on the Senate trial as well. I want to turn to our legal panel, giving us so much illumination over the course of this trial. Kate Shaw, let me begin with you, Professor at Cardozo School of Law. What's your takeaway from the experience?
Well, the Constitution creates a very high bar for removing a president, right? 2/3 supermajority in the Senate. We've never done it, right? So in some ways, that was never a very realistic possibility going into these proceedings. I think that the sort of verdict of history will take time to come in, but I don't think it's very likely that history will judge this to have been purely an illegitimate and partisan effort, the way the president's defenders would like it to be. In part because of what John Carl was suggesting, you know, the president's members of the president's own party, not just the Mitt Romney defection, but the condemnation of a number of Republican senators, I think makes it hard to suggest that the president's conduct here was above reproach, and that if there was serious misconduct, what the Constitution creates is impeachment, even if conviction is a very difficult bar. So I think there'll be a lot of questions about the strategy that the Democrats use to pursue this impeachment and removal, but there is a degree of condemnation that is coming out of these proceedings that is bipartisan. And that, I think, is one important takeaway from the perspective of history.
And when we look at this historically, we still don't know exactly what's still to come. And I don't mean regarding investigations in the future. I mean even on the very issue that was being addressed here. We're going to get those additional documents. We're going to hear from people who were there. History will be determined in part by the very information that didn't come out in the trial. That is going to help us determine exactly how it should be viewed, because we're not going to be constrained by time or rules of any kind of evidentiary issues. It's just going to be simply, oh, yeah, we got more information that we didn't have at the time, and I think that's going to help shape it. I do think there's going to be a look back strategically at the way Democrats did what they did. Should they have subpoenaed more witnesses earlier, et cetera? But I think that judgment in part will be dictated by what more comes out, and B, the most important issue, which is how does this get viewed politically? If November 2020 they're doing exit polls and they ask people about impeachment, and the bottom line is that President Trump ends up squeaking it out because there were enough people who were irritated at Democrats about impeachment, well, then that's going to be very important historically.
And this is Melissa Murray, constitutional scholar at NYU. This is a unique situation. President Trump, of course, the first president impeached who's now going to face the voters in November.
Well, so that will be an interesting legacy. What will be the residue of impeachment on President Trump's reelection prospects? But I think the lessons here are twofold. One, I think we've seen the expansion of the unitary executive theory, something that's been building over the course of this presidency. Alan Dershowitz's defense of the president really entrenched it and indeed expanded it. The idea that anything that is good for the president must be in the public interest. We've never seen anything like that. That will certainly be part of executive politics going forward. The other thing I think goes to Kate's point. What is impeachment for? And if impeachment isn't for conviction and removal, but is merely condemnation, is that really the kind of effective check on presidential power that the framers envisioned? They certainly didn't envision this kind of partisan polarization that in this climate, impeachment really could not work.
Chris Christie, let me end with you. Susan Collins, who ultimately voted to acquit the president, the senator from Maine, said as she was making that vote, she believes that President Trump will learn a lesson from this. She's now amended that statement to say she hopes he'll learn a lesson from this. Will he learn a lesson from this?
So no one who holds that office wanted to have what just happened right now. And the president clearly is unhappy about this entire process. But I'll say now, probably for the 50th time on this air, what I've said over and over again. This is who he is. And he absolutely believes, because I tell you, he's looked me in the eye and told me that he believes that there was nothing wrong with what he did. And so by that measure, you have to take him at his word that I don't think that he will take from this that he has to amend his conduct. And I think he believes this is what the people of the country voted for and the way he's going to continue to conduct himself because they support him and because that's who he is.
I have to ask you a question that I asked him back in June. Do you think it's conceivable that he, in a conversation with a foreign leader, will ask for information for the election?
That I don't believe is conceivable, no. But I think that we're talking about a broader personality here. And that personality we've seen is much different than anybody who's ever occupied that office before. And all of us in this country are adjusting to a new and different approach to the presidency. And so he's not going to change who he is because he believes that it's that personality that got him to the Oval Office. And he believes, and the numbers are now starting to show even more, that people are supporting him even more now. And this was the great risk that Nancy Pelosi understood. I think when you look at the rewrite on this, Nancy Pelosi is going to be seen to be much smarter than her own party thought she was. She saw this coming. She was afraid that if they swung and missed, they'd make him stronger. And at least as we sit here now, 9 months before the election, he looks stronger now than he was when she first decided to go ahead with this last October.
Mary Bruce, let me bring you in as well, senior congressional correspondent. Been there every step of the way up there on Capitol Hill. What lesson has Speaker Pelosi taken? What comes next?
Well, I think the Speaker would say that she obviously feels that she made the right decision here, that it was worth doing this, even though, of course, she was reluctant to take this step. But there is no question, especially after the tension between the two of them at last night's State of the Union, that there are very big questions about the lasting damage done here between the two parties. Look, we are accustomed to bitter partisan fights here in the hall of the Capitol, but what we have seen over the last several weeks has taken that up a notch significantly, and it has laid bare for the entire nation just the depths of that divide. And there will be, I think, a lot of big questions about whether that can be overcome. How can these two sides work together, if at all, going forward? I have to say, George, there is a sense of surviving a very brutal fight here. This has been bruising. The Senate feels exhausted. And now this fight, of course, though, will continue. As Mitt Romney says, it is now up to a higher court, the American people.
The American people, and President Trump has weighed in as well, sending out a tweet suggesting Donald Trump not only in 2020, but up to the year 70,000. Now it's 90,000 and counting. We're going to return now to our regular programming on the network. Our coverage will continue on ABC News Live, and a full wrap-up tonight on World News Tonight with David Muir. The Senate trial of President Donald John Trump has adjourned.